in the end, it's a password thing, but for now, the CNS Twitter account doesn't work, which is very frustrating. In the end, it's a password thing, but for now, the CNS Twitter account. Feel that sound. And wow, everyone coming in last minute.
Hello.
Good morning, Abby. You're not printing anything for us today.
I have to, but I have forgotten. Later.
Later, right. Okay. Let me share the link. Where's our chat?
Anna is walking.
I know she's taking the cat to the vet. There it is. That's real dedication. Joining online, walking to the vet. She's smiling. Right. So, as you know, we have a new rota, which I'm also going to share in the chat so you can all see when it's your turn. And the random generator thought that I hadn't done it in a while, so I should do another Neuroccino. So here we are. I'm doing Neuroccino number 4 since the summer break. But I'm actually quite excited because I read a paper this week that very much resonated with me and my current thinking. And I greatly enjoyed reading it. It's more a opinion piece or commentary. So there's a lot of ideas and thoughts in there. And because there is more than we have time for, I'm briefly gonna share with you. Yep. Here you go. So there's a lot of concepts in that paper that are being discussed, and I want to have the time to go through them all in great detail. So I'm showing you here our CNS Academy, where Michelle in 2021 actually went through each and every single one of these models of how the brain works in great detail. So you have about an hour per topic. So if you really want to dive deeper, you have all the relevant background information on our channel. The playlist is called CNS Academy, Principles of Cognitive Neuroscience. And you can see that there's a lot in there for you to absorb. Now, I wanted to put that first because a lot of these concepts are being touched on in the paper that we're going to discuss today. But we won't have the time to go into great detail. So today's paper is this one. It's called The Tip of the Iceberg, a call to embrace anti-localizationism in human neuroscience research. And the authors are no strangers to this crowd, I guess. Now, what is the story of the paper? The story is basically very short, neat abstract here, that we have relied on localizationism. Now, that's a concept that's very essential to this paper, given that it's called basically a call to anti-localizationism. So localizationism is the idea that one brain structure, one area, one tract, whatever you want to call it, one cell even, has one function. And the classical example that's also given in this paper is Broca's area and Wernicke's area for language articulation and comprehension. Now, this paper makes the claim that localizationism has been the dominant framework that neurosciences have worked with, and also the methods that we use have facilitated that particular framework. And they provide a couple of examples of where localizationism worked, for example, in medical applications, where a tumor can be mapped with a type of cancer, and removing that tumor is then dealing with the cancer. So you have this one-to-one association to some degree. And then our methods are also tailored towards answering questions within a localizationist framework, but then they also show the shortcomings and propose a theoretical way forward, not very much a practical way, I would say. So let's dive into it. So the introduction is very much focused on there has been somewhat of a paradigm shift, the entangled brain that pretty much most of you read. Just checking it's in the living room. That was published by Luis Pessoa last year, I think it was. And he also edited a special issue with the same name that summarized a big chunk of the current thinking in a special issue. Then at OHBM this year in Montreal, we had an educational course that was called Beyond Blobology, where leading statisticians looked at where we are and where we can go methodologically and statistically. And then there was also a debate or an opinion piece that was pro-emergence. So the functioning of the brain being an emergent function, which is the fundamental principle that we're talking about today. I should have mentioned that before. And as you can see, that stirred quite a few reactions online. So the argument here is that this is a hotly debated topic with very strong opinions. And one thing that resonated with me quite a bit is actually this first argument, because when we published our paper on emergent properties, we actually encountered exactly the same thing. So some people came out saying, well, this is not new. We've known this for centuries. And others came out saying, whoa, this is radical. What are you thinking? So this seems to be a common thread that we can't really decide if this is something new or something very old. So that very much resonated with me reading this commentary. Now, they then spent some time going into the historical foundations of localizationism, which this audience knows very well. So we have the classic examples, Broca's and Wernicke's, where basically one area serves one function. And the emergence of neuroimaging in the 20th century that then facilitated that, and some Zyniker. What's the English word for Zyniker? I see mouthing attempts, but no reaction. Anyways, cynic, yes, thank you. Cynics would argue that fMRI is basically a color-coded phrenology. And I tend to agree to some degree with that statement. But the idea here really is that the methods that we have are a result of the framework that science was operationalizing the functioning of the brain in, and that kind of reinforced itself as well. So we have this blobology maps of the brain as it was put for the educational course. And then really the idea here is that we have the reductionist approach, which is the perspective that mental processes can be reduced to or are identical to neurobiological processes. And this is also in other places referred to as a mapping problem, that we don't have the same resolution for cognitive processes and biological processes, and therefore they don't really map onto each other one-to-one. Now, here are a couple of examples where that actually worked, sort of biological reductionism, and in medicine, sort of reductionist medical model that I alluded to. And there's a couple of examples here, and that this together was quite enticing to then consider that the brain works exactly the same. But it turns out, after throwing a lot of work hours, a lot of funding, and a lot of creative thinking at it, that actually is not that straightforward. And we still don't have a complete map of the brain, not for its structure or its function, actually. So we're missing something. And yeah, here we go. That we're missing something was made very promising, not just because our models tend to not translate well to the clinical world, but also we had the crisis and the turning point that everyone knows as the reproducibility crisis. And they put that down in part to us missing essential steps of how the brain actually works, and therefore underrepresenting the complexity of the brain, which then leads to the reproducibility crisis, among other suboptimal research practices that also facilitate not being able to reproduce previous findings. So these are a couple of the examples they use as evidence against a simple one-to-one mapping between phenomena and brain anatomy, structural functional brain anatomy. And this was recently summarized, if I'm not mistaken, this year, in a paper by McCaffrey promoting anti-localizationism, which can be distilled to 3 facts, basically. And I think it's easiest if we look at the figure, which it took me a while to get through. It's not very intuitive, but here we go. Before you try to make sense of the figure, here's the principal idea. So there is 3 opposing views. So the first one is specialization versus neuronal reuse. And the idea here is that you can either have brain areas that are specialized for one function, or you can reuse some of the neuronal infrastructure for multiple cognitive domains. Point number 1. The second dualism is the localization of function versus neurodegeneracy. Now, what that means is basically similar to the first point, that we have multiple systems for one functions, and that can be seen especially in the presence of brain lesions and recovery, where other systems can jump in and take over and compensate. And then the third point is trinsicality versus contextualism. And here they then make the jump to holism, which you can see in the figure just here. And that's why I said we have this entire channel where there's a dedicated lecture on holism. But the idea really is, and that's why I don't like this visualization, holism is linked to equipotentialism. And that just means that every part of the brain is connected to the other parts. And if you have a lesion, for example, the entire system goes down. So you don't have a specialization within one network or one area that is then selectively knocked out. But one lesion, no matter where in the brain, will decrease the functioning of the entire brain. Now, these are the general concepts, and then they put forward a framework is probably too much, but some suggestions of where we should go in the future. where their thinking is around the brain most likely relying on partial holism. So that means that rather than having this equipotentialism where the entire brain does the same thing and everything is connected to each other, the proper functioning is probably some aspect of it, but not to that extreme. And they also segregate cognitive processes into two camps, basically saying that certain cognitive processes may be specialized. And here they're looking more at the lower level cognitive processes, bottom-up automatic processes that function through specialized circuitries in the brain through redeployment or recycling of brain structures. Now, this again is a whole different topic. And for those of you who are local, we had the Nijmegen lectures last year that were completely dedicated to the neuronal recycling hypothesis by Standean. And that we can fill an entire hour discussing the word recycling and the concept behind it. But the fundamental idea here is that brain areas, for example, the visual word from area, that part of the brain used to be there before we learned to read and write, and it must have had a function prior to us acquiring the skill. But then when we acquired the skill, that part of the brain specialized for this new gained cognitive process, which can be considered as recycling. Now, from there, they then suggest that we should do two things. And where's their table? Here we go. The two things are somewhat summarized in this table, but the fundamental idea is that we should make broader use of computational frameworks. Full disclosure, the first author is a computational neuroscientist, so no bias there. And for that, we should look at complex systems. So that includes network neurosciences, that includes control theory, dynamic systems, and so on and so forth, and machine learning approaches to the brain. And then the second level they propose is to use multi-level frameworks. And that is to say that we should consider the context, our environment, a lot more, and have compatible explanatory pluralism, which I had to write down. But the idea is really that you, rather than do what we tend to do these days, where processes that we consider too complex or not understood enough or don't know the interaction, we tend to take them out statistically and treat them as nuisance variables. And the idea here really is that we allow those multiple levels of explanation and try to use the data that we have in our approach to explain what we observe on multiple levels and across levels as well. So really a push towards domain-specific expertise with interdisciplinary expertise. Here are all the details. There you go, compatible explanatory pluralism, got it right. And then the conclusion is very much that we need theory to move forward, but we need theory in a clever way. And the advances of imaging and methods will push us forward, but it has to go hand in hand with our theory, which some of you know is a debate that I recently took an issue with. If we just take one and not the other, and especially if we only take the methods and not the conceptual and theoretical frameworks behind it. That's it. That's the paper. I just wanted to also, before I happily take some questions, questions are already up. Just very briefly also point you to this resource, which is the Atlas of Human Brain Connections from Marco Catani and Michel Thibaudet-Schotten. And on page 52, let me go back. You have this image which captures some of what was discussed in the paper. So you have the localizationist approach, where one area has one function and you have a lesion to one area, you knock out selectively that part of the brain. Then the associationist approach is where these areas are segregated into distinct local networks, and a lesion will then impact the local network. And the holistic view is that everything is connected to everything, and you have a lesion in the brain that then has a knock-on effect on the entire brain. So there's also more information and resources available there. Right, hands are up. I think Lilith was first.
Yeah, thank you for presenting this paper. I mean, I want to read it all now. So
mission accomplished.
I have two questions. So the first one, well, was about machine learning part. So they suggest that machine learning will allow us to understand the relationship between brain and behavior. But the thing is that machine learning doesn't necessarily find etiological, it's different from etiological studies. So in the end, machine learning gives us association between predictor and our outcome, or whatever we want to predict. So it's basically correlation, more or less, and not causal inference. So how can we understand how brain works if we just find different confounding or some variables that can contribute into predicting, but it does not necessarily tell us the causal relationship between brain and behavior, if it's even possible? I don't know. Yeah.
A very good question. They make the point in their commentary that we have to advance in all directions, right? We have to bring our theory in to have an idea of directionality and implications, but we also have to advance our methods and also grow comfortable with the idea that maybe we can't properly understand or explain how these models are built or predict, and that might be okay. So these are the 2 points. To come back to your question in more detail, that actually goes back to my opening statement that the paper is more an idea and a framework rather than a very hands-on practical guide of this is what we should be doing. But there is this special issue that I mentioned in the opening that's cited in the introduction, so you can have a look in there and see if you find more detailed answers on how to use machine learning in this particular context.
Okay, thank you. And the other thing is, so about the notion of holism, I don't remember if it was Florence or Lashley, but I think one of them was also having this partial holism idea, because I think Florence was saying that motor low-level functioning, they are like localized, while higher level they have this equipotentialism thing. So do you think it's kind of what they are suggesting, that we have to keep revive his ideas and follow him then?
They don't, as far as I'm aware, they don't specifically cite him but it sounds very much like the same idea. And that also brings us back to the introduction. Like, this is not necessarily a new idea. These concepts have been around for a while. So the assembly of the ideas and the framing of it might be new. That the fundamental ideas have been floating.
Yeah, because it always goes like circular in the beginning, it's localization, and then there was a lot of holism, and then again it was overshadowed by localization, and maybe now it's time we are okay, let's again think about holism.
To me, I guess, makes the point that none of these frameworks by itself explains the variety of cognitive processes that we can do, and that maybe we do have to tap into more specialized, i.e. localizationist approaches for one cognitive function or one cognitive process at a given time, but then use and rely on other frameworks and more dynamic ways of how the brain could work for a different cognitive process or the same cognitive process at a different time. So I think we need a lot more flexibility, but that flexibility only just became possible given the new computational powers, the new data that we have, and this new discussion.
Okay, thank you.
Eduardo.
Yes, well, my question is more about so they propose as a possible way to solve these impasse, to have more theory-driven approaches to investigating whatever you're interested to. And my question is, also this point has been an issue for a while for now, right? So how is it possible to solve this problem if the previous literature is already suffering from this, kind of lack of theory-driven approaches? Because even I have the impression that since the introduction of fMRI, there's been kind of massive experiments coming out, but a lot of them not properly set into a theory, investigating pretty much production of a nice picture of the brains, but it's not really set into a strict framework. So
I mean, fundamentally, it's all on us, right, to bring the theory back in. So you can take the approach of, wow, I have all this data and I have these cool fancy methods. I just put it together and see what happens. Or you can sit down and read and think and conceptualize what you would expect given the body of literature, and then do a more theoretically driven experimental approach with data and methods. Now, I'm not saying that we should only do one and not the other. I think we can learn a great deal from both approaches and using them in a combinatory way. And it's not the case that the entire literature is void of theory. There's a lot of literature out there where people were thinking really, really hard.
That's for sure. But I was just thinking about this problem of, I'm not against exploratory analysis, but it's the risk is that interpreting your data after seeing the results, and that's kind of a problem.
See, for me, the proof of the pudding is always in the clinical translation. We can come up with data-driven models, we can come up with theory-driven models, but if they don't work in the clinic when you see the patient, they're no good. And then I don't care if they're data or theory-driven. Probably slightly more if they're theory-driven, because then you have an anchor to come back and change things based on changing your theoretical approach. But really, models are great. I love models, but they have to serve a purpose. A model for the sake of a model, to me, doesn't really make much sense. But if we can show that a model actually holds in the clinic at an individual level, then we make use of it, and then we're going in the right direction, because then all this theory, all this data, all this computational power is put to good use and actually makes a difference. But it takes a long time until these models actually can be tested in clinical populations. And again, there's no one size fits all. It might be that models work for some clinical populations, but not others, just because the mechanism of diseases are different as well.
Thank you.
Annie?
Just one final comment, because I think it ties in nicely with how you started all this, that this is not new. Or for some it is totally. So I
Depends on who you ask. Yeah,
exactly. That is exactly my point, that we talked about this before, that it's still incredible how little the anti-localism is known to some crowds, or vice versa maybe. And I think it's still a shame that whoever gets to teach doesn't have to teach the opposing view. And yeah, I think it's just a good reminder that usually the truth is somewhere in the middle. As you said, we might find out which ones are. Yeah, and I hope we can all keep educating people on both sides of the spectrum.
Oh, that's very nice. And I fully agree with that. Which is also my one critique or main critique about this paper, which is it's not a framework as such. It's not a new model of how the brain works. It goes against what we think we know about the brain. So calling it anti-localizationism or anti-reductionism to me is not the best framing of it, because we shouldn't just be anti what has been done before, but actually conceptualize it in a new way and have a nicer name than, oh, we're anti this. So even though I conceptually have a lot of points of convergence here and the paper very much resonated, that's one thing that really did not resonate well with me. But that's personal preference as well. Right. Any other questions, comments? No, in that case, thank you all for joining us on this Monday morning. We have, if I'm not mistaken, we have a CNS talk next week that Michelle is going to host, but to be confirmed. And Anna is doing a Neuroccino next week. So do stay tuned for that. Do join us on Monday morning. And I'm just going to quickly check. 22nd. That's next week, right? Yes. So we have a CNS talk next week by Malar, who cancelled on us before due to illness, on multi-species translational neuroimaging. Do join for that next week, Wednesday. Have a great week. Bye.